You're listening to Making the Cut, the mostly true life story of a retired surgeon from 1C Productions.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Seitz, founder and president of 1C Productions. This episode contains explicit language and adult content. It is intended for mature audiences only.
Life is a curious and fragile thing, isn't it? Loving Victoria showed me how glorious and wonderful it could be, but also how very different we were culturally and societally. Did she know that I cared for her deeply? That she validated me? Had she also sensed that my first passion was surgery? To master the knife, to make the cut?
We went to have Victoria's engagement ring sized. She loved it. The stone glittered and sparkled. With its exquisite Victorian setting and shiny, multifaceted, brilliant stone, the ring looked attractive on Victoria's finger. She glowed with radiant beauty. Mrs. Goldberg was happy to meet my beloved. She beamed her asymmetrical smile without drooling. She had obviously seen the neurologist that I had arranged for her. We stepped out into Woburn Place.
When is the happy date?
We both shrugged. We had not thought that far ahead. It made more sense to see if we qualified as physicians first. The news that we were betrothed spread like wildfire. We decided to have a small engagement party at Mother's place, a flat south of the Thames in Blackheath. She claimed she had moved from Manchester to London to be closer to me and to give me a home. I wasn't sure why she'd done that. I was never going to be going backwards, fulfilling Mother's fantasy that I needed her. I was going forwards, having found my identity in the medical field and my belonging, not in Mother, but in a surgical career. Victoria and I had very different visions for the engagement party.
Canapé, Scottish smoked salmon, and champagne.
How very British of her. I pictured a continental tea with sandwiches, sausages, and lovely cakes.
Well, we can at least agree on the guest list. Friends.
And some of my UCH classmates.
And mine, from Westminster Hospital. Will your family come from Egypt?
I doubt they could make such an expensive trip. What about your family?
Oh, well, we'll invite them, certainly.
We bumbled through the friction between us, disconcerted by each other's plans, but never stopping to discuss our expectations or agree on an overall concept. When the party rolled around, we stepped into an interesting, if puzzling, cultural hybrid. Throughout our party, I basked in the congratulations of my colleagues. It appeared that everyone had a wonderful time. Victoria showed off her ring, and I took pleasure in her joy and the radiance of her beauty. We had no definitive plans for the next step, although Victoria's mother intimated that she dreamed of a grandiose wedding for her daughter.
Darling, you should have the best wedding in a cathedral, wearing a princess dress with a long train and a tiara. Oh yes, a tiara. Think of all my guests in their fancy hats, lots and lots of friends. There'll be flowers, wonderful flowers, and of course, bubbly. Lots of bubbly.
I could not imagine squeezing such an event onto the conveyor belt of medical school studies, commitments, and exams. I considered myself a most lucky man for having Victoria tangibly love me. She was the most beautiful, intelligent, an intellectually mature woman that I had ever fallen in love with. Victoria made me feel deserving of her and worthy of myself. She did not see me as a fucking foreigner, but as a unique person with an international background, in reasonable command of 3 languages, and the personality traits of determination and drive to excel. She made me feel accepted by my peers, for a true English girl loved me, despite the insults I had endured.
I want your brown babies.
Imagine. Yet, the true meaning of love and commitment was scary. A feeling of vulnerability. Perhaps love was not permanent. Victoria's father had a wife before marrying Shirley, and after his demise, she had boyfriends. Mother looked through my father's photo album after his death and speculated aloud if a particular woman who appeared with my father in a photo taken with many attendees at a conference had been his mistress. The issue was all very bewildering, and there was no confidant to counsel or guide me. I knew Victoria was committed to me, and her devotion gave me strength. Yes, I could commit. I vowed to commit to Victoria, even forsaking tenuous past romances. Come what may, she would always be first in my life. I would take care of her and any little brown babies. In spite of this, I feared her bond to me might weaken, leading her to desert me, as had all the others whom I desperately loved. With our engagement party behind us, my second obstetrical rotation at a district hospital in London's East End began, and quickly became a nightmare, as I once again came under the authority of the bully registrar. He strutted about in his green scrubs and white boots like a puffed-up army general, intimidating the midwives, bossing about the students, and ignoring the patients. The midwives did all the work, and most of the teaching, too. The East End was where the new immigrant wave tended to settle. A large percentage of the patients admitted to the unit were from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, patients we seldom saw over at UCH. The registrar, the prick, regularly failed to encourage midwives to perform episiotomies when a baby passed through the birth canal and out the vagina. He willingly let mothers who were birthing their first or had large babies tear. He should have repaired these tears. Instead, he left them for the students to suture. He did little except push us 3 students to sew quickly, without due concern to prevent future urinary or fecal leaks. I spent most of my days judiciously sewing up complicated tears. The registrar's end-of-day rounds began at 8 p.m. We followed him, hoping to be taught. We were ignored. He frequently stopped and asked midwives the status of their patient's delivery. On one occasion, a young Indian woman had been in labor for over 12 hours. She looked drained. He did not examine her.
If she hasn't delivered in another 8 hours, we'll section her.
Why did he not examine her to determine the cause of the slow or obstructed labor? How did he decide on 8 hours? From where did this magic number originate? By 3 a.m, it was clear that the only way to deliver the baby was to perform a C-section. The patient was wheeled into the operating theater. An on-call anesthetist registrar appeared. She was from the Indian subcontinent, looked very sleepy, and saw the patient for the first time to familiarize herself with the medical obstetrical problems. Her consultant did not attend. The other operating room personnel had clearly been dragged out of bed. They looked tired and unenthusiastic. By 4, the registrar appeared. looking about himself with an air of satisfaction. He had used the power of his authority to assemble the tired crew for an ill-timed operation. He asked the scrub nurse to assist him, indicating by default that we were to watch. The operating light shone harshly on the woman lying on the table, her distended belly covered with a sheet. Her chest and breasts were immodestly exposed, so the anesthetist could observe her breathing. The registrar and his nurse scrubbed, gowned, and stood on either side of the table, waiting for the patient to be anesthetized. A sedative was intravenously administered, and when the patient started to slump, the anesthetist placed a gas mask over her nose and mouth. I watched apprehensively. I had never seen a cesarean section before, and the lack of monitoring of mother and baby surprised me. The circulating nurse began to wash and drape the belly, and the anesthetist fussed about with the dials of her machine. I did not see the patient's chest rise or fall. Suddenly, the circulating nurse noticed that the exhausted and dehydrated mother had died. Half-hearted attempts to resuscitate her followed, but failed. No one attempted to save the baby. By 4:20 a.m., the registrar degowned and walked out of the theater. I had just witnessed my first death on the table, and it seemed entirely avoidable. Horrified and disheartened, I left the room distraught. I expected detailed deliberations would ensue in the next few days. Where were the consultant obstetrician and anesthetist, whose job it was to supervise the training of registrars? The blame for the disaster and the grievous loss of 2 lives imposed on a husband and family lay at the feet of the registrar for a critical error of judgment. Yes, a major error of judgment. Murder due to neglect. There was a need for an open and honest discussion of the mistakes committed, so everyone could learn from them and prevent this from ever happening again. I thought that this death would become a teachable moment, but also give the students a chance to express their shock, anxieties, and concerns. To mourn. No such review ever occurred. Instead, the coroner ruled the deaths as a misadventure. 2 deaths had occurred on the table, and it was a misadventure? My God. I lived with the agony, with the trauma of what I had seen. It would never have happened at UCH because of a culture of supervision and accountability. My already low estimation of the registrar descended further to one of dangerous, even criminal, incompetence. If he felt any remorse or humility, he did not show it. I avoided him, focusing instead on sewing up tears and performing episiotomies in contempt of his decisions not to do them on Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi women. As if to distract me, I received word I should go to a theater where a gynecological procedure was about to start. Thinking I was to scrub and assist, I rushed down from my on-call room, only to find a darkened room. Light from 2 blinding overhead operating bulbs harshly pierced the blackness, illuminating the upper-lower abdomen of a woman. The sole operator was the new surgical house officer, who stood on the patient's left with forceps in one hand and dissecting scissors in the other, both hands trembling. From out of the dark, a disembodied voice spoke.
Now pick up the fallopian tube. No, that is the small bowel. The other tubular structure next to it, and tie it off using the silk thread the nurse is passing to you.
As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I saw a man in scrubs, hands behind his back, the body to the voice. I turned to a fellow student. What is going on?
He's Catholic, and she's having her tubes tied.
Why is the registrar not scrubbing and doing the operation?
Some Catholic surgeons refuse to perform a tubal ligation solely for birth control, to comply with the ethical and religious directives of the Catholic Church.
Didn't he take the Hippocratic Oath? What did he tell the patient? The instructions ceased, and the registrar stared at me. I got the message and walked out, feeling I had transgressed by loudly questioning events. A week later, another mad decision of a 4 a.m. cesarean. Another maternal and fetal death of a young brown-skinned woman. Another coroner's pronouncement of death by misadventure. Did the husband know that his wife and baby had died at the hands of an incompetent physician, who by all standards should have been charged with manslaughter? How could this physician live with himself, or even look in the mirror? Fury raged inside me, and an irrational fear gripped me. Would I one day be responsible for an operating table death? After what I had seen, my flirtation with becoming an obstetrician died. I packed my bag and left Hell's Crucible well before the official end of the rotation, in dismay and protest. A few days after the second misadventure, I responded to an advertisement urgently seeking a surgical locum house officer. The rotation was for 1 week on a Mr. Simon's general surgical service at the Whittington, a general district hospital in Archway, Islington, North London, a solidly lower middle-class district. There would be no payment, as I'd be serving as a student locum. I applied to enhance my surgical skills and quench my thirst to operate, but above all to bury my frustrations at the unbelievable crimes I had recently witnessed. My friends told me that Mr. Simon had a busy service, serving a large white population, many of whom were originally from Central Europe. The census, however, showed an influx of new immigrants from Africa. I telephoned Victoria. Hello, sweetheart. I've accepted a 1-week locum house surgeon at the Whittington starting tomorrow.
Oh no! I hoped we could spend the weekend together.
Well, it's an opportunity to cut. Mr. Simon has a busy general surgical unit. You know, the bread and butter stuff I don't see at UCH. It's good experience.
Well, I'm so busy with my clinical rotations, I can use the time preparing for an upcoming exam. I'm sorry you'll be cooped up at a distant hospital, so far away from me.
After it's over, we'll find some time together. Good luck on your exam. When I turned up at 11 a.m., as instructed by a secretary, Mr. Simon looked me up and down. He was a stocky, square-shouldered, hard-faced man of middle height, probably in his mid-50s.
Where have you been? You're late. Where are you from?
University College Hospital.
No, man. What country?
Egypt, sir.
Go change. I'm about to start a case.
Would my ethnic background ever not be a question they asked? Why couldn't I just be a human? A medical student? Once in theatre, we embarked on a gastrectomy. The left lobe of the liver somewhat obscured the upper end of the stomach where he was working. I diligently retracted it out of his way, fearing that if I pulled too hard, the edge of the retractor would crack open the liver's lining, causing a lot of bleeding.
Pull, man! Retract the liver! Be careful! Can't you see I'm struggling?
I adjusted the retractor and gently did as instructed. His field lay in semi-darkness.
I can't see properly. Nurse, adjust the light to shine into the field.
The circulator grabbed the edge of the operative light above his head and tried to move it to illuminate the area where Mr. Simon was working.
No, that's no good. It's worse now. Fix it so I can see.
She tried several times to move the overhead fixture so that the beam of light hit the area under the liver. Each time he complained more irascibly. Another nurse nudged her aside and tried for a few moments. It was obvious to me that the mechanics of the overhead light required grabbing the light handle and adjusting the beam straight down into the operative area.
You're both useless. Give me a sterile glove.
He slipped the new glove over his blood-stained one and, stretching overhead, took the handle and adjusted the light to his liking. Slipping the contaminated glove off, he resumed operating. I had never seen such behavior, contemptuous demeanor toward the operating room nurses. They were from Ghana and Kenya, respectively. I was mortified, noting that they distanced themselves from his vicinity while remaining in the room. He was like many other upper-class English, still living in the heyday of a glorious empire and waning Great Britain, wearing an air of fashionable superiority while claiming England was now being invaded by a flood of ex-colonial foreigners from Africa, India, and the Commonwealth. Winston Churchill clearly expressed such an attitude in his writings, particularly in his book The English-Speaking Nations. I had encountered this attitude in Victoria's mother's utterances and tolerated them good-humoredly because the irony was she and her sister had come to Great Britain from New Zealand in the 1930s. Also, I loved her daughter. Later that night, a phone call from the emergency department surprised me. A patient needed attention, potential appendicitis. Unfamiliar with the hospital complex, it took a while to find where I needed to go in the maze of corridors. I felt confident about making the diagnosis if need be, having encountered several cases of appendicitis during the nights I'd spent in casualty at UCH. However, when I met the 17-year-old young man, his symptoms were anything but typical. Hopeful that Mr. Simon would come to my rescue despite his performance in the operating theater earlier, I called him and related my concerns.
Do you know what time it is? Call your registrar.
I got the message that he was well into his third scotch and certainly did not want to be bothered with minor procedures such as an appendectomy. I should have realized that he would be no nicer to me than he was to the other staff that attempted to help him all day long. The registrar was also a locum, had arrived in the early evening. We'd not yet met. It was somewhat jarring when I called him. He told me he would come in a little while. Why was he not on the premises familiarizing himself with the patients? I retreated to my on-call room. As I lay on my bed, resting, I wondered what exactly did "in a while" mean. This is Dr. McGead.
Where the hell have you been? Get to the operating theater. Now!
This time I knew which corridors to take. I arrived to find the patient already asleep.
I did not expect to be doing your job of getting the patient in here prepping him for surgery.
I was too tired to respond that I had expected to meet him in casualty while the young man was awake in order to decide together if this surgery was even necessary. Instead, I scrubbed and gowned. He had moved in on the right side of the operating table, the conventional operating side, and without a word started the appendectomy. I assisted, but not without feeling a great degree of resentment because he had stolen my case. He had rushed into an operation instead of examining the patient with me and weighing up the positive and negative findings that would lead to the conclusion of either operating right away or watching the patient, re-examining his abdomen every 1 to 2 hours, see how the case would resolve. An appendectomy is a house officer's or intern-level operative case. Further, he did not take the golden opportunity to teach me and, if an operation was necessary, take me through the case. The whole experience was reprehensible. I vowed that if I were ever in his shoes, I would not steal an operation from a more junior colleague. To me, this was plain surgical etiquette. As he reached the appendix, the sight pulled me from my thoughts. The appendix was lily white, perfectly normal. So, I had a bigot for a consultant and an irate locum registrar who was self-centered and seemed chronically angry and joyless, and who missed every opportunity to teach a novice. This was not the environment in which I wanted to practice. Despite feeling uncomfortable in Mr. Simon's racist presence, my philosophy was that I could learn from everyone, both positive and negative lessons. I had no time to consider it much anyway. I was too busy preparing my patients for the next day's operations, assisting during surgeries, and caring for the patients during their post-operative period. I barely slept 4 hours a night, if I was lucky. The tension and stress level rose dramatically when Mr. Simon was in theatre. He was always in a hurry, appeared agitated, barking orders to whoever stood near. He was a clumsy surgeon, like a ballet dancer in workman's boots. On my last day, during afternoon rounds, we came to a patient from Central Europe on whom Mr. Simon had not operated. She complained of constant abdominal pain. Her belly was thin and scaphoid, sunken with a concave rather than the normal convex contour. I saw the crosshatches of numerous surgical scars. She was a diagnostic enigma to Mr. Simon, since all routine tests were normal. He was convinced she had Munchausen syndrome, a psychiatric disorder in which patients seek attention by falsely claiming medical maladies. Each day the patient insisted in her heavy accent that she suffered from abdominal pain and could not sit up, get out of bed, or eat. Standing beside her bed, briefly glancing at my shoulder before looking into space somewhere between Sister and his registrar, he mumbled under his breath.
Never operate on pain. You'll find nothing, and you'll leave the patient with a scar. Pain alone in the absence of other findings is a perception in the head and not a disease in the abdomen, not a surgical disease.
A standoff followed. We shuffled in awkward silence as the patient lay helpless, her abdomen exposed. Finally, he spoke.
There's nothing wrong with you.
He turned to Sister.
She should be discharged.
Each of us stared at the other. What was going to happen? My heart pounded as we all must have wondered how he would resolve the confrontation.
Get me a glove and lubrication.
He knelt on the floor, while Sister positioned the patient onto her left side in the traditional knee-chest position. With a gloved finger, he did an incredibly forceful rectal. I took a step back, appalled at the unnecessarily vigorous exam. Was he a sadist, too? As he withdrew his finger with a smug expression on his face, a massive squirt of liquid stool sprayed all over his vest, shirt, tie, and suit jacket. We would have cheered if we had dared. A shit-covered Mr. Simon rapidly retreated. That was my last and enduring picture of him. I left that evening. So, what did I learn in 1 week? A surgeon should overcome ego, recognizing personal limitations and fallibility. Above all, compassion was called for when dealing with fellow humans, for they were as fragile as ourselves.
Helplessly watching mothers and babies die at the hand of a reckless registrar taught me both of life's fragility and of my coming influence over it. As I stood on the fragile side of the cultural divide, Victoria's love served as a bridge to my stable, sane, and more sure side. My German mother's callousness was similar to the registrar's insensitive behavior. I intended to rise above their ways, to always see life as something worth serving and supporting, no matter which side of the cultural divide I was on.
You've been listening to Making the Cut from 1C Productions. Making the Cut was written, produced, and directed by Rebecca Seitz, based on Michael McGead's manuscript, Mastering the Knife. Noah James played Michael McGead. Other roles were brought to life by the voice talent of Nicola Waldron, Trisha Brio, Jackie Weiner, Harvey Miller, Steve England, Gareth Rockcliffe, and John Cuban. Audio engineering provided by Zisher LLC. Making the Cut theme music by Kyle J. Baker. Learn more at makingthecutpodcast.com.